Sarah Henderson thought her life was perfect until she discovered that her husband, Brian, was having an affair. But the real shock came when she learned that the woman he was cheating with wasn't just anyone. It was her mother, Diane. Now, with a child on the way and her world crumbling, Sarah must navigate the painful aftermath of betrayal, family secrets, and the devastating consequences of a love she thought would last forever. The Henderson family had always been the epitome of suburban perfection. On the outside, they were a picture of success and happiness, living in a beautiful, spacious home nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street. Sarah, a dedicated high school teacher, spent her days inspiring young minds. Her husband, Brian, was a prominent lawyer, respected in his field and admired by the community. Together, they were the perfect couple, their love seemingly unwavering. Their daughter Lily was a bright, ambitious teenager with a promising future ahead of her. To their neighbors and friends, the Hendersons were the gold standard of family life, charming, loving, and always at ease. But as with many outwardly perfect lives, things were not always as they seemed. Behind closed doors, the couple's marriage had begun to show cracks. Brian had become distant, preoccupied with work, and his once jovial nature seemed to vanish. He spent long hours at the office, often coming home late or staying away for days on business trips. Sarah, though initially supportive of his career demands, began to feel the growing emptiness in their relationship. Conversations that used to be filled with love and laughter were now replaced with silence or polite exchanges. Sarah tried to understand, attributing his behavior to the pressures of his demanding job, but over time she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, Sarah put the changes down to stress. Brian had always been a workaholic, and lately his career had been taking a toll on him. But what troubled Sarah even more was the lack of intimacy in their marriage. The connection they once had seemed to disappear with the passing months. When she tried to approach him, Brian would brush it off, claiming he was just tired or had a lot on his mind. Sarah, unwilling to confront the possibility of a deeper issue, dismissed her growing concerns. She didn't want to believe that the man she had married, the man she trusted with her whole heart, could be anything less than faithful. The distance between them continued to widen, and Sarah began to feel more like a roommate than a wife. She tried to reignite the spark in their relationship, planning small getaways and special nights, hoping to restore the intimacy they had lost. But nothing seemed to work. Brian was always too preoccupied, too absorbed in his own thoughts to truly connect with her. Sarah's frustration grew, but she was determined to make their marriage work. After all, they had been together for over a decade, and she had always believed in the strength of their bond. One afternoon, Sarah had a thought that seemed harmless at first. Her mother, Diane, had been living alone ever since her husband passed away a year ago. She had been struggling with loneliness, and, to make matters worse, Diane's health had started to decline. Seeing her mother in such a state of emotional turmoil, Sarah thought it would be a good idea to invite her to stay with them for a while. It seemed like a simple solution. Diane could benefit from the company, and Sarah could help take care of her. At the same time, it would give Sarah and Brian a chance to spend more time together, as she hoped her mother's presence might help bridge the growing gap between them. Little did Sarah know that this decision would be the beginning of this unraveling of everything she had known and trusted. When Diane arrived at the Henderson home, it seemed like the perfect solution to Sarah's growing concerns. Her mother, now in her late 50s, had always been a kind, gentle woman, but the loss of her husband had left her shaken. Sarah had always been close to her mother, sharing a bond built on years of mutual respect and love. Diane's arrival brought a sense of responsibility to Sarah, who felt a renewed sense of purpose in looking after her mother during this difficult time. At first, everything appeared normal. Diane settled into the guest bedroom, and Sarah ensured that she had everything she needed. Brian, though distant, was polite and welcoming to Diane, offering her the kind of attention one would expect from a son-in-law. For the first few days, the house was filled with the sounds of Diane's laughter as she and Sarah spent time together. They talked for hours, reminiscing about old memories, and Sarah found herself reconnecting with the mother she had always adored. But as the days passed, a subtle shift began to occur. Brian's behavior toward Diane became increasingly warmer. It was small things at first, shared glances, private conversations, and a familiarity that seemed to grow with each passing day. Sarah didn't immediately notice the change, assuming it was just the normal bonding between family members. After all, Diane was grieving, and Brian's professional background had always made him someone who was compassionate and understanding in times of distress. However, as the weeks passed, Sarah started to feel uncomfortable with how much time Brian and Diane were spending together. Their conversations seemed to go on longer than necessary, often lingering into the late hours of the night. Diane, who had once been a guest in their home, began to take on a more central role in their daily routine. She'd join Brian in the kitchen to cook meals together, laugh at his jokes, and share stories from their pasts that Sarah had never heard before. At first, Sarah thought it was just the natural course of things, two people getting to know each other better. But something didn't sit right. She began to notice that Brian's affection toward Diane seemed to go beyond mere politeness. It was more intimate, more flirtatious, in a way she hadn't seen before. There was a connection between them that felt wrong, but still, Sarah dismissed it. She trusted Brian and never once imagined that something darker could be brewing behind the scenes. In the evenings, she would retreat to her work or to Lily's school projects, giving her husband and mother space to spend time together. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's once blind trust in her husband began to falter. She began to feel uneasy whenever she saw Brian's hand resting too casually on Diane's shoulder, or when their eyes lingered a little too long during conversations. One evening, Sarah walked into the kitchen, only to find Diane and Brian alone, laughing at a joke that seemed far too private. The moment Sarah stepped into the room, the conversation immediately stopped, and the tension was palpable. Brian quickly excused himself, retreating to his office, while Diane, visibly flustered, offered an awkward smile and turned back to her cooking. Sarah brushed it off, telling herself that it was just her imagination running wild. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. In the days that followed, the small moments of discomfort began to accumulate. Sarah began to pay closer attention to the subtle interactions between Brian and Diane, trying to make sense of the growing tension in the house. What had once been a seemingly innocent arrangement was now starting to feel like a fragile facade. The discomfort that Sarah had been feeling slowly morphed into suspicion. The more she observed her mother and husband, the more she saw things that didn't add up. The intimate glances, the whispered conversations in the corners of the house, and the unspoken familiarity that had developed between Diane and Brian were becoming harder to ignore. It wasn't just her imagination. Something was happening between them, something far beyond what Sarah had anticipated when she had invited her mother to stay. She had hoped Diane's presence would bring them closer together, but instead it seemed to be creating an invisible wedge. One evening, Sarah returned home earlier than usual from work. She had planned to surprise Brian by cooking his favorite meal and spending some quality time together, trying to repair the growing rift between them. As she stepped inside the house, she noticed the unusual quietness. It was almost as if the house had fallen still, the air thick with tension. She called out, but no one answered. Curious, Sarah made her way to the living room, where she found Brian and Diane sitting close together on the couch. They were watching TV, but their posture was off, too close, their shoulders touching. Diane was laughing at something Brian had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When Sarah entered the room, the conversation suddenly stopped. Diane quickly withdrew her hand, and Brian sat up straight, his face flushing with what looked like guilt. Sarah's heart began to race, her stomach turning in a way she couldn't explain. She didn't say anything immediately, but felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She excused herself, retreating to their bedroom, where she closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts spinning. She could feel her pulse in her ears as she tried to process what had just happened. The scene in the living room had been innocuous enough on the surface, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. She was no longer able to ignore the growing concern that there was an emotional connection between Diane and Brian, one that seemed to go beyond anything a mother-in-law and son-in-law should share. It wasn't the first time something had felt off. There had been other small moments, little touches, fleeting glances, but this was different. This was undeniable. The next morning, Sarah decided to confront Brian. She couldn't live in a state of suspicion any longer. When she found him in the kitchen, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before speaking. "Brian, what's going on between you and my mother?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Brian looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then his face softened and he tried to explain. He assured Sarah that it was nothing, that Diane was just grieving and needed someone to talk to. He told her he was simply being a good son-in-law, offering support during a difficult time. Sarah wanted to believe him, but she couldn't. Her instincts were telling her that something deeper was happening, something Brian was unwilling to admit. A wave of disappointment washed over her as she listened to his words. She had always trusted him, but now that trust was being slowly eroded. Sarah tried to push past the nagging feeling, convincing herself that maybe she was overreacting. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. Her relationship with Brian, once so strong, now felt like it was on the edge of a cliff, and she didn't know how to stop the fall. Over the next few days, the tension between Sarah, Brian, and Diane became impossible to ignore. Sarah kept her distance, not wanting to confront the painful truth that she wasn't ready to face. But her suspicions were only growing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the man she had married and the mother she had trusted were hiding something from her, something that would change everything. As the days dragged on, the unease in the Henderson household became unbearable. Sarah's suspicions had reached a boiling point, and her internal struggle between confronting the truth and denying what she knew deep down was eating away at her. She could feel the tension in the air every time she entered a room where Brian and Diane were together. The warmth that once characterized their relationship now felt cold and distant, leaving Sarah with a sense of impending disaster. But nothing could have prepared her for the shocking discovery that would change her life forever. It all came to a head one afternoon when Sarah arrived home early from work. She had gone to the grocery store, and the thought of getting dinner ready for the family had distracted her. But when she opened the door to their home, she immediately noticed that something was off. The house was eerily quiet, and the usual sounds of Brian and Diane talking or laughing were absent. A strange silence hung in the air as Sarah slowly made her way through the hall. She paused outside their bedroom door, hearing soft murmurs from inside. It wasn't the usual noise of television or idle conversation. It was too intimate, too private. Her heart began to race. She stood there for a moment, wondering if she had misunderstood everything. Perhaps she was just being paranoid. But her instincts told her otherwise. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, and her worst fears were realized. Brian and Diane were not just talking. They were in the middle of an embrace, holding each other too closely, their faces inches apart. Diane's hand was resting on Brian's chest, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a moment of raw intimacy, one that no mother and son-in-law should ever share. Time seemed to stand still as Sarah's eyes locked onto the scene in front of her. Brian immediately pulled away, his face filled with shock and guilt. Diane looked equally horrified, her face pale as she stumbled to stand up. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Sarah's shaky breath as she stood frozen in the doorway, struggling to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Her mind raced with the implications of what she had seen. It wasn't just an emotional connection. This was something far more serious, far more destructive. "Sarah, Brian began, but she didn't let him finish. The words caught in her throat as she struggled to keep her composure. Every ounce of strength she had seemed to evaporate in that moment. Her hands trembled as she turned and walked out of the room, her heart shattering with each step she took. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to leave. She needed space to think, to process everything that had just happened. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, her mind replaying the scene over and over again. The image of Brian and Diane, holding each other in a way that no one should ever see, haunted her every waking moment. How had it come to this? How had her mother, the woman she had trusted and loved, become involved in something so devastatingly wrong? By evening, Sarah knew that she couldn't just ignore what she had witnessed. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no denying it. She needed answers, but she wasn't sure she was ready to hear them. Her mind swirled with questions. How long had this affair been going on? How could Brian betray her like this? And what would happen to her family now? With a heavy heart, Sarah confronted Brian later that night. The conversation that followed was one filled with anger, tears, and disbelief. Brian admitted to the affair, though he claimed it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness. He told Sarah that he had never meant for it to go this far, but his words did little to soothe her. The damage was done, and no amount of explanation could undo the hurt. But there was one more revelation that Brian dropped in the middle of their emotional confrontation that shattered Sarah entirely. Diane was pregnant. The revelation sent shockwaves through Sarah's already fragile sense of reality. Her mother was carrying Brian's child. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, a betrayal that she would never be able to fully comprehend. The affair had gone from an emotional betrayal to something far more tangible, more real. Sarah felt her world collapse around her as she struggled. to process the full extent of the devastation. Brian begged for forgiveness, but Sarah could barely look at him. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved for so long, had not only betrayed her but had also torn apart the very fabric of their family, and now, with Diane pregnant, there was no turning back. The affair had consequences that Sarah could never have imagined, and the future she had once envisioned seemed to slip further away with every passing moment. The days following the revelation of Diane's pregnancy were a blur of chaos, emotions, and uncertainty. Sarah's mind felt like a storm of confusion and disbelief. She had been blindsided by the affair, but learning that her mother was carrying Brian's child sent her into a spiraling descent of shock. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her every waking moment. It felt like her world had been torn apart by forces she couldn't control or even understand. In the weeks that followed, Sarah distanced herself from both Brian and Diane. She couldn't bear to be around them, couldn't look at her mother without feeling a deep, gnawing pain. How could Diane, the woman who had raised her, betray her in such a way? How could she, of all people, have become involved in a relationship with her own son-in-law? The image of Diane's pregnancy made everything even more unbearable. The thought of a child being born into this mess seemed cruel and unjust. There was no way Sarah could reconcile the woman she had always known with the person who had destroyed her family. Brian, desperate to make amends, tried repeatedly to apologize, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to listen. His words felt hollow and insincere, a mere attempt to patch up the pieces of a shattered life. He begged her to forgive him, to somehow salvage their marriage, but the trust between them had been irrevocably broken. Sarah had given everything to him, had trusted him more than anyone, and now that trust had been shattered in the worst possible way. No amount of apology could change the reality of what had happened. Sarah knew that divorce was inevitable. She no longer saw a future with Brian, not after what he had done. But the decision wasn't easy. After years of marriage, of building a life together, she couldn't simply walk away without a deep sense of loss. The life they had built, everything they had worked for, now felt like a lie. The love that once seemed unshakable now appeared fragile and hollow. She felt as though she had been living in a dream, and the dream had abruptly ended. In the midst of this turmoil, Sarah also had to confront her relationship with her mother. Diane, though also devastated by the situation, still claimed to love Sarah and wanted to repair their bond. But how could Sarah ever look at her mother the same way again? How could she ever forgive the woman who had not only betrayed her, but had destroyed the trust between them in the most unforgivable way? Diane's pregnancy served as a constant reminder of the affair, a permanent mark that would forever change their family dynamics. Though the pain was overwhelming, Sarah made a decision. She knew she had to move on, to find a way to reclaim her life from the wreckage that had been left behind. She sought therapy to help her process the trauma, to rebuild the pieces of herself that had been shattered by the betrayal. Slowly, Sarah began to find her footing again. Her heart was still heavy, and the scars would never fully fade, but she started to realize that healing was possible, even if forgiveness wasn't. One day, Sarah made the difficult decision to sit down with Diane. Their conversation was long and emotional, filled with tears, apologies, and the overwhelming weight of what had transpired. Diane admitted to her mistakes, but Sarah couldn't fully absolve her. The wound was too deep, and the damage too great. In the end, Sarah chose to forgive Diane, but not for the sake of healing their relationship. She forgave her because she knew that holding on to the anger would only continue to poison her heart. Brian, on the other hand, was a different story. The divorce proceedings moved forward, and Sarah found herself slowly building a new life, one that no longer included him. She never truly got over the pain, but she learned to live with it. In time, she became a stronger version of herself, wiser, more cautious, and more self-aware. As for Diane, the pregnancy ended up being a constant reminder of the painful chapter in their lives. But Sarah chose to move forward, knowing that while the past could never be undone, she had the power to control her future. It wasn't easy, and the scars of the betrayal would never disappear. But Sarah understood one crucial thing. She could survive this. She could rebuild her life, even if it would never be the same. And with each day, she grew more determined to move forward, stronger and more resilient than she had ever been before.